Thank you for joining us for this recorded version of the webinar, Growing Resiliency, Meeting the Needs of Children Surviving Incest. This webinar is put on by the Lifespan Project of the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. The Lifespan Project is a 5-year initiative to help service providers, including law enforcement, advocates, health personnel, prosecutors, and others, reach victims of all ages to provide trauma-informed care to survivors of sexual violence. The initiative builds on the Office of Violence Against Women's work to support those service providers as they try to meet the complex need of sexual violence victims. Now I'm going to let our speakers introduce themselves and get started with the webinar content.
Thank you, Erica. My name is Allie Malin-Parado, and I'm an online resource specialist at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Before I started working at the NSVRC, I worked at a local rape crisis center as a children's advocate, providing counseling, advocacy, medical and legal services, and then also education for anyone under the age of 18 who came into our center and their significant others. That included parents, siblings, friends, grandparents, anyone who could possibly be a part of the life of a child, usually in a positive or caretaking role.
Hi everyone, this is Lexi Leibelsberger, and I'm the Children's Advocacy Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. Prior to my work with PCAR, I was a child and adolescent therapist at a local program, working with children who were survivors of sexual abuse and their families. And I'm very excited to be sharing about this topic with you today. So today we will be talking about the resilience of children, but also the resilience of yourself. If any of the information shared today is difficult for any reason, please be sure to make note of the trauma resources shared and take good care of yourself, however that makes sense for you. From the title of today's webinar, you may have a sense that we'll be talking about the impact that incest has on children and families, and how you as an advocate can help to facilitate their healing. Resilience is often a significant part of the journey from victim to survivor. In cases of incest, there are barriers to healing that may not exist in other cases of sexual abuse. For this reason, it's all the more important to focus on the strengths of the child and the family, tapping into their natural resilience. Take note of these 7 characteristics of resilience. We'll be talking more about them later on in our discussion.
So this is Allie again, and I'm going to take a few minutes to kind of lay some groundwork for what we're going to be going through today. And we wanted to start by trying to establish a definition for incest and understanding what incest is and what it means to a child who has disclosed experiencing incest. To get started with incest, we need to have an understanding of what is child sexual abuse. And the NSVRC usually draws on some work from research that explores and defines child sexual abuse as when a person exposes a child to sexual acts or behavior. And this can involve sex acts that involve perpetration. It can involve touching the child's breasts or genitals. It can involve making the child touch the perpetrator's breasts or genitals, voyeurism, exhibitionism. So all of these different things that a person could potentially expose a child to. And then there are other forms of sexual abuse, like showing child pornography, for instance, or exposing them to sexual content early, soon, inappropriately, unnecessarily. And sometimes things like this are just disguised as an education for the child. So we want to be mindful of understanding what's appropriate and inappropriate sexual education and sexual behavior for a child. We're also talking about things like child sexual exploitation, like trafficking or child prostitution, as some people may call it. But it's exploiting the child for the purposes of making money. And then there's internet-based child sexual abuse, like creating or depicting children in pornography. Grooming behaviors are also really, really common in child sexual abuse. We're going to talk more about grooming, what that might mean, a little bit later. Now, if you think about child sexual abuse in the context of incest, we're thinking about child sexual abuse by a family member. So we need to have an understanding of what family means for our webinar today. Family members can include relatives by blood or marriage. So examples might include siblings, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, anyone who's related to that child. And so incest, our working definition today, is child sexual abuse perpetrated by a family member. Now I want you to keep in mind that people who are not necessarily related in this way by blood or marriage may still be viewed as or understood as family members from the child's perspective. So an example is like a parent's significant other who's not married to the parent but a significant other. A close family friend who lives in the home or who's an integral part of the family may have some of the same behaviors and interactions with the family and with the child that a family member by blood or marriage may also have. So a child, even though they may not experience incest under the law, they may still experience all of the same signs, symptoms, and behaviors of a child who experienced incest by a family member based on our definition. So we acknowledge that there can be different aspects or parts of incest and experiences by a child, but we also know that no one experience is unique or limited by legal definitions. And today, we're going to be talking a lot about the disclosure as the point of impact where things might start to change for a child who's experienced incest. A disclosure is one way in which incest may be discovered, potentially leading to a formal report and legal implications. A child makes a disclosure when he or she informs another person about the sexual abuse that they experienced. Children may disclose to other family members, friends, adults, including teachers, coaches, folks in the community that they're connected with on a regular, everyday basis, people they trust. And it can happen intentionally or it can happen accidentally. So we're going to talk about some of those differences between those two. Disclosures, when they're intentional, are usually, it happens as the child comes to the decision that they'd like to tell someone, that they've thought about their experience. Unintentional or accidental is when another person notices actions or behaviors or comments that the child's making, sometimes through play, sometimes through their interactions or just what they're talking about, but it leads that person to then suspect child sexual abuse. Now, it's important that when a child decides to tell someone, so they make this intentional disclosure, they may feel more ownership over the disclosure and it may help in their healing process, but it can also lead to what we call recanting the disclosure, where the child may go back on what they said because of fear, because of concern, because of, doubting themselves or not liking the outcomes of making that disclosure. And those intentional disclosures can happen in a planned way where the child thinks about it, or in an unplanned way where they're trying to tell someone, but it's not this active verbal disclosure that, a child comes and sits down and says, I'd like to tell you something. It's this unplanned, intentional disclosure. It blurts out, the lines are a little blurred, and whether the child really meant to tell you or they told the person they really wanted to tell. And that can be kind of confusing for the child because, it's like when you blurt something out to a friend, you're like, oh, did I really want to say that? And you have that instant feeling of regret. So we want to be wary of that in the way that we provide care for these children. When we talk about accidental disclosures, we're talking about actions or behaviors that indicate a concern for sexual abuse. So there's some organizations like Stop It Now, for instance, that use a traffic signal to explain some of those signs and symptoms where a green light behavior for a child is normal, healthy sexual development. So, asking questions about their body parts or discovering that touching your genitals feels good and trying to figure out, what that means in terms of age or developmental context. If it's something that's expected behavior, then it's not concerning. It's just part of that child's general sexual and childhood development. But then as you move through the traffic light, you move to yellow light behaviors, which are things that are, a little bit concerning. They're not quite the norm in terms of sexual development or expected age-appropriate behavior. These are behaviors that warrant conversation, some follow-up, and a close watch for other behaviors. Red light behaviors are very concerning behaviors. So they include things like excessive masturbation to the point of harm or discomfort, or forcing other children to assume sexualized positions. So these are like controlling, harmful sexual behaviors that we would absolutely never expect a child to be exposed to or to have knowledge of. And many of these behaviors will happen during play, and play or play acting is one way that children figure out their world. So they use this to try and unpack the experience of sexual abuse, and that may be the way that they process it. And while these signs may not be verbal, they can still lead to disclosure when a caring adult notices and intervenes appropriately. Okay, so we're going to move on to talking about the difference between the experience of abuse versus the experience of disclosure for children. Now, for a child who's been experiencing sexual abuse, it's usually an experience that's ongoing and normalized by the perpetrator and minimized by the perpetrator through grooming behaviors. So these grooming behaviors are actions or activities that lead the child to a point where they may experience varying levels of inappropriate sexual behavior, but not feel that they need to tell someone about it. So it's part of the process of abuse, and it usually starts with things that aren't really that concerning. Things like, I'm bringing you a present, or let's, hug when I see you, and just testing those waters and those behaviors to see at what point the child will feel that a line has crossed. And the idea is to do it in such a subtle and ongoing, time-intensive way that the child never recognizes or realizes that they should be telling someone about it. It's part of the process of abuse. So we know that abuse is often this ongoing normalized behavior, and it's part of building a relationship that to the child may seem really positive. Whereas a disclosure of abuse is usually viewed as a one-time event. It's the impact point. It's the turning point in the child's life. They've been experiencing abuse for a long time. They've been experiencing grooming for a long time. But that disclosure feels like the point at which things change. So for a lot of children who enter counseling or something right after they experience sexual abuse or right after they make a disclosure, they may spend a lot of time talking about the disclosure and the aftermath of the disclosure in a bigger or more resounding way than to talk about the abuse itself, because they're still trying to figure that all out. So we want to spend some time today talking about how to build that sense of resiliency that Lexi was talking about after the disclosure is made. Now, something to keep in mind, I mentioned it briefly earlier, was this idea of recanting or recantation. So that's when the child takes back their disclosure. And recanting is a legal term, but the idea is just that the child says, no, this didn't happen, or they talk about it one time and then never talk about it again and pretend that nothing ever changed. And this is a normal behavior. It happens in many cases. Committing a disclosure takes a lot of courage, but living through the aftermath of that disclosure can be even harder. Remember, this is when, a family member or a close friend gets taken away, when economically things change for a family because the perpetrator may have been a provider of some kind. The child can experience pressure from other family members to, did this really happen? That questioning of their experience, all that's really challenging for a child to live through. They may also fear the perpetrator retaliating. So the perpetrator made threats as part of their grooming behavior, part of their abuse. The child doesn't forget about all that once the disclosure is made. That's still a part of their experience of the abuse. And they may just want a calmer way of life, like it was before disclosing, when, family wasn't in an uproar and they didn't have to go to court all the time and talk to strangers or police officers that wear scary uniforms. They may just want to go back to quote-unquote normal, the way things were. And the way that adults respond to disclosures and handle that aftermath can impact whether or not a child recants. And we do this in a way by building this healthy, strong, supportive environment that doesn't feel like the world is turned upside down. So this is a wonderful quote that I wanted to share with you. The existence of a significant caretaker who is supportive and protective in the family system appears to be extremely important in the prognosis of positive treatment outcomes for children surviving sexual abuse. So what does this mean? It means that if the child has a loving, caring person in their life who can support them, give them feelings of safety and protection, then that's going to make a huge long-term difference for this child. And that's what we want to do as advocates working with children. We want to build the capacity for as many people in this child's life as possible to provide this supportive and protective environment.
This is Lexi again. We're going to talk now a little bit about the response to disclosure. Allie's given us a really good background on what the disclosure might look and feel like for families, and now let's talk more about your role. So it's not simply the act of disclosure, but it's really, like Allie said, the meaningful support that follows the disclosure that promotes healthy emotional functioning and really helps children to feel better about themselves. So in order for a child to benefit and minimize those adverse effects, we really need to give them a positive and supportive response. So when we're talking about your role as an advocate, we're focused again on the response of the disclosure and the support that you offer. And when I was preparing for this presentation today, I thought back to my direct service experience. And really, when I would do an intake session with a caregiver, it was important for me to know the circumstances surrounding the abuse, but almost as important, it was important for me to know the circumstances following their disclosure and whether they got support following that or not. So while the response of that primary caregiver is vital, it's also important to know that anyone who spends a significant amount of time with a child in a caregiving role, just like that quote that we just read, really has the ability to make a positive impact. So this is you as an advocate, this is teachers, childcare providers, folks like that. Affirming responses should be simple and reassuring. They can come in many forms. There's not one right answer, but the basics are listen to the child, believe the child, and respond with language that reinforces strengths and promotes resilience. Be clear about what you will do with the information given, but do not make promises about safety. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, as advocates, we're not often the first people that a child discloses to. You can always use these affirming responses, even if you are the 10th person the child has disclosed to, or you don't even receive a direct disclosure. You still have an opportunity to validate and support them. Statements could be something similar to, "You're very brave," or "Thank you for sharing that with me." These are really simple, but they really promote resilience. Now, unfortunately, if support is not received following the disclosure, the child may further feel a sense of powerlessness and lack of worth. These are feelings that are only reinforced by the dynamics of the abuse that Allie talked about already. Common potentially harmful reactions, and I'm sure that you've all been privy and witnessed some of these, are denial and disbelief, minimizing the abuse, and blaming the victim or child. These harmful reactions to a child's disclosure can cause re-victimization. Sometimes we refer to this as secondary wounding, and really further the child's feelings of guilt and self-blame. The pain of secondary wounding, I've found, is sometimes even more prominent than the abuse itself. It really minimizes the child's pain and attacks their character, integrity, and self-worth. The response, whether it's positive or negative, that a child receives following disclosure has lasting implications for their future healing. So, while children who receive a supportive and affirming response following disclosure won't be void of trauma reactions, they certainly will still have them. They're more likely to feel better about themselves and their outlook on life, and that immediately taps into their inner strengths and resilience. So, the takeaway message from all of this is that your response as an advocate really matters.
Thanks, Lexi. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about some of the layers of impact. So we know that we all live in this world where we have different layers or circles of association or relationships that influence the way that we think and talk. These layers commonly are referred to in the research world as the social ecology. So they include our individual circle, so just us. They include our relationship circle, which is all of our relationships, family connections, and influences in that way. They include a community circle where we interact with others in our immediate community environments. This could be a school or church, the grocery store, the different places where we frequent on a regular basis. And then there's the circle of society. So the big social circle is, laws, culture, these big things that influence the way we think or react and behave, and that we may have some influence on, but it's a lot bigger than our everyday experience. I'm going to use this model of these 4 different layers to talk about the impact of incest to a child. So let's start off and think about the individual layers. So we're going to talk about the common experiences or characteristics of a child first. So I have, a picture of a child up here. I'm going to tell you a little more about him in a second, but I want you to take a moment and call to mind some of the common characteristics of children in your life. So just take a second, think about it. When you think of children, what characteristics do you come up with? Some examples that, I might throw out there are children are playful, they're curious, they can be whiny at times. There's lots of different characteristics and qualities that come to mind when I think of the children in my life that I really care about. And we know that all children have all of these different qualities and characteristics, and they have their own unique qualities and characteristics, and then there are some really common ones. And having this in mind is going to be really helpful as we think about how we want to provide care to these children. Now, I want you to think again about the qualities or characteristics of a child who's experienced sexual abuse. So what comes to mind when you think about a child experiencing sexual abuse or disclosing sexual abuse? There may be a variety of answers that you come up with. Some might be really positive, like brave or resilient. And then some might be qualities or characteristics that we think about because we're concerned, like the child might be scared, they might feel shame, they might feel guilty, they might isolate themselves, or they might be really outgoing. So there's lots of things we may come up with. These experiences are personal and they're individual, so they're on this individual level for this child, and these experiences are common reactions to uncommon experiences. So abnormal or developmentally inappropriate sexual exposure can impact a child's understanding of the body, sexuality, what a healthy family means, and relationships. They may feel unsure or confused. They may experience things like nightmares or avoiding certain situations or sadness. They may act out in a sexual way as they're trying to figure it out, or they may try to cover it all up by acting as quote-unquote normal as possible and just, be the kid that they want to be. And all of these are normal reactions, again, to a really abnormal situation. We want to keep in mind that all these different qualities and everyday characteristics, like the ones that I first asked you to think about, like playful and curious, they're all still there underneath or in addition to some of these other experiences that a child who's experiencing abuse may exhibit. Children are remarkable and they're resilient, and they may need your help to address or work through some of their own individual tough stuff. But they'll also benefit from developing healthy relationships that support their growth, and that's true for any child, whether or not abuse is present. So I told you I was going to introduce the child on the screen, and we're going to work from my introduction and kind of use that to explain and explore the rest of our levels. So I'm going to call this child Chris, and Chris is a 5-year-old. He's in kindergarten. He's really excited about going to school. He really likes his teacher, even though sometimes she sends notes home about him being distracted and not paying attention in school. But he really likes it for the most part. He loves to talk about all the things he does during the school day with his mom and his dad and his sister, who's 8, when they come home and they have dinner at night. And some of his favorite activities are soccer and playing the piano. He started learning how to play the piano about a year ago, and he gets lessons from his grandfather, who's his mom's father, and he goes to their house once a week and has, time with grandpa to learn the piano, and he really likes doing that. He really enjoys music. One day, when his mom picks him up from piano lessons with grandpa, he tells her that sometimes grandpa plays his keys while they are having their piano lessons, and she thinks this is kind of strange. So when they get home, she asks Chris's dad to talk with him more about it and try and figure out what's going on. So for Chris, or for any child who's surviving incest, we know that relationships are super important. The person who perpetrated the abuse holds two important roles. So one is as the family member. So in Chris's case, it's his grandfather, who teaches him something that he really enjoys, who, they have a good time at his house, and he loves him. The child may love and care about the person who's abusing them very much, while on the other side, this person is an abuser. They're exploiting or causing harm to a child in a sexual way, and that's just not okay. And the child may have trouble reconciling these two identities for someone that is their family member. They love and care about them, but they're also doing something they're not comfortable with, or that doesn't feel quite right, or that they're being told to keep a secret. And we know that children often operate with this black and white understanding of the way the world works. So someone is good or someone is bad. There's not good and bad in all people, even though as adults we like to think that we know that there are good and bad elements and gray parts of every person's personality. After disclosure, the family environment may also shift in some pretty major ways. So the offending family member may be removed. The non-offending family members may be left to support the child. So in Chris's case, this could mean that his grandparents were providing child care because both his parents worked, late shifts. So they lost access to that child care, and they're going to have to find a way to make up for that. It can also be an effect on Chris if the family imposes guilt or shame on him for, ruining a good thing or causing these allegations. Mom may not be able to reconcile that her father was able to abuse her child, even if dad is really supportive and believes Chris right away when he makes his disclosure. Mom may really question it and have trouble finding a way to make that relationship work. So these can all impact or influence the way that Chris responds or reacts in this relationship level of the social understanding. So as we move on and talk about the community level for Chris, we know children operate in lots of different social spaces all the time. And I mentioned this can include places like the grocery store or going to school every day, his soccer team. These are all things that Chris has daily communication or impact with other adults, with other children, and with other spaces where there are different social rules. After disclosure of incest, the community may shift the way that they interact with Chris. So if this comes out and it's in the newspaper that Chris's grandfather was convicted of thus and such activity, you may find that community members like teachers or coaches might start to handle Chris with mittens, treat him in a different way, or show extreme caution or reservation in their interactions. They're not interacting with him as the happy, bubbly, soccer-loving kid anymore. They're interacting with him as the child who experienced incest. On the other hand, children may experience their communities reacting to them and ignoring it completely, pretending it didn't happen, saying oh, he's young, children are resilient, there doesn't need to be any kind of care in place, I'm just going to pretend that nothing ever happened. And this can be really confusing. It can lead to children not getting the support that they need. So we talked about Chris getting distracted in his classroom a lot. If his teacher doesn't allow for, the fact that that could be a normal reaction to experiencing abuse, then he may start to not do as well in school because he's not receiving the support or the positive redirection that he needs in order to focus and still care for his feelings and responses. A second consideration around the community level is the way that the child interacts with his or her community. So they experience that community influence, but at the same time, they are also interacting with the community in how they determine how they feel safe about talking about their abuse. So some children will make an effort to keep it a secret. They won't tell anyone. They want to keep all their needs and concerns inside so that it doesn't influence their interactions with the community and it's a big secret. And that's really expected because oftentimes grooming encourages secret keeping. On the other hand, and this is what I experienced as more common concern for parents or for families, is the child who wants to tell everybody. They talked about it. They want to tell teachers, coaches, other children, the lady behind you in line at the grocery store. And while it's a really good thing that the child feels empowered or open to share their story, this can also lead to some really difficult situations. Not only embarrassing, like, oh my gosh, the lady at the grocery store thinks this about our family now situations, but also opening up the child to potential, unsafe experiences or re-victimization. Working together with the child and other supporting adults to identify what safe boundaries are and how and when to talk about their experiences in a safe way can make a big difference. The society level for our impact, it's probably the biggest level and the hardest to grasp. Like, how is our culture possibly going to affect the way that this child, that Chris, is reacting? And I want to emphasize that disclosures of something like incest launch the child into a much bigger connection with the social world. So all of a sudden, they're a part of the court system, or they're hearing about laws and working with other members of the family and talking with members of the district attorney's office. So some of the big picture, like laws and society things, are influencing the everyday experiences of this child, and trying to figure out and navigate that can be really difficult and challenging. Children are also exposed to societal level messaging on a daily basis. So what they're seeing in the mass media, what they're hearing about on TV, if they see that, grandpa's picture is on the local news, and trying to figure out how they are connected with that and how their disclosure is connected with that, it's a lot to navigate for a young mind that usually is not, that closely connected with the big S society. It can also influence their perceptions or ideas about sexuality or masculinity or femininity. So we have all of these messages going on at once. And it's important to be mindful of them and understand where the child is coming from and how they're interacting with all these different social levels. Now, I'm going to take our example of Chris and move on to talk about impact to the family. So we see Chris's family here, and we see that they're also working within all of these different levels. We know that families have a major experience of impact when incest is disclosed. So just to give you some ideas, there's a lot in the aftermath, and there's some very real costs and changes that families face. Some studies suggest that up to 2/3 of children will be removed from their homes at some point after disclosure. 40% of families go on public assistance. 50% may have to change where they live. And income may decrease by an average of 40%. So these are very real economic costs associated with disclosure, and the stress and pressure on non-offending family members to provide a safe and healthy environment for the child can be really overwhelming. So we want to keep that in mind as we're providing care to the child. Good care for the child is going to include good advocacy for the whole family. These can be really simple things like having stable transportation to get to appointments or court hearings that may be really challenged if the perpetrator was the only person in the family who had a car, for instance. The family may lose half of their support in terms of caring for the child. Increased costs for babysitters, where, like, for instance, Chris's parents were providing child care for the parents while they were working in the evenings. And the person who committed the incest may have been in all of those supportive roles as part of their membership in the family and also their grooming behavior. It's also important to note that there are emotional costs to non-offending family members. They may also feel the same confusion as they try to figure out their loving feelings for the person who committed the abuse with the fact that that same person sexually abused their child. It can lead to marriages dissolving, family members experiencing, a feeling of loss or tension in their family relationships, or high levels of emotional stress in addition to the burden of protecting the child if the offending family member is not removed. So all these things, all of these different levels also impact the whole family, and we want to keep that in mind.
So just as we touched on earlier in the presentation, the disclosure of child sexual abuse typically catapults the child and family into crisis. So the uncertainty really needs to be addressed and the child and family stabilized before we're processing any sort of trauma. Let's talk about providing support for both the child and family as a whole, as Ali said is so important. So what you're looking at is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've probably all seen this before. And what we really want to emphasize today is taking an approach that addresses needs from the bottoms up. So the physiological and the safety needs really need to be met before anything can be done on a higher level. So these are very, very basic things like food and water, having a good night's sleep, feeling safe, your health, and having resources like transportation that we've talked about already. You can support the child and family as an advocate by assisting with tangible resources that you can, so maybe food or clothing, housing, childcare, if those are things you have access to or at least know where to point them in the direction of, that could be really helpful in making them feel more stable and safe right now. And explain any of the processes that you are able to help reassure the child and family. Just like Ali said, many of the children and families in situations of incest might be launched into the legal system and the justice system. And remember that they're most likely very foreign systems to them. So a little education about those things can really go a long way in reducing their anxiety. So if we think again about Chris for a moment, we've talked about maybe on Wednesday evenings when he went to piano that maybe his grandparents were providing childcare, and now that that's not happening anymore because it's turned out that it's not a safe situation, Chris's family might really be in crisis and not know where to turn. You know, maybe they don't feel like other family members are safe right now, or who can I trust with my child? Perhaps also his grandparents might have helped with some of the bills or expenses. What does that mean for the family now? So just some things to keep in mind when you're working with these families. You may also find in your work that dealing with loss is primary in your work with children who've survived incest. So when you think about loss, don't just think about the major losses, some of the things maybe that Ali has highlighted, but think about some minor losses too. In my experience, what we might call minor losses are like stuff that kids have. And stuff is really important to kids. Maybe a favorite t-shirt or a pet they had to leave behind or just their room. So it's important to just remember that if it's significant to them, then it really is significant, and to not minimize those things. And along with physical losses, just like Ali spoke about also, children who are survivors of sexual abuse by a family member are faced with heavy emotional losses. So this is a loss of innocence, a loss of an ideal relationship maybe with grandfather. You can support the child and family as an advocate by just validating and normalizing these feelings that come along with the losses. Again, if it's significant to them, then it's significant. And allow the child to share. Maybe that's drawing a picture or expressing themselves by words or in writing about what the loss feels and looks like. So if we revisit again our example of Chris, the most significant loss to him right now might be his grandfather, might also be his grandmother, depending on how she's responded to the disclosure, and also something like his love of piano. Maybe right now he's not able to play piano because they don't have a piano in the home, and so that's also a loss that he's experiencing. Let's talk a little bit about feelings. Again, we talked briefly earlier about the conflicted feelings so often that kids and families might have when they are a survivor of incest. Disclosure itself might also bring up feelings of anxiety, fear, and shame. Some common feelings that we see in children are anger. Sometimes people are afraid of anger, but anger is really a very healthy and appropriate emotion. This might be difficult in a situation of incest because Chris, for example, may not be able to express his anger directly at grandfather, and so his anger may come out in different ways. Often we see it coming out at mom or dad, sort of being misdirected anger, and so that gets complicated in families. Certainly confusion or mixed feelings, that's a big one for kids and families also. Children who have survived incest, like we talked about, have mixed feelings toward the person who perpetrated the abuse. So again, this idea of positive and negative things that all go into that relationship. Also, guilt and shame. Most survivors of incest feel some sort of blame for their abuse. The person who abused them might directly have communicated this blame, this is your fault, or you did something to bring this on yourself. But even if the perpetrator has not verbalized that, children and adolescents will often take on this responsibility themselves. Again, our example of Chris, he could be feeling to blame for tension in the family. So let's say maybe mom has a brother or a sister who is not supportive, doesn't believe that that grandfather could have done this to Chris. And so now Chris can't play with his cousins that he used to play with. So as adults, we might understand these family dynamics and why that's not able to happen. But really to a 5-year-old, this feels like I shouldn't have told, this is my fault, because this happened and now I'm not allowed to play with my cousins. You can support the child and family in situations like this by allowing them to share their feelings without judgment. I've heard so often from kids that were in my office that this is the only place they could really show how they really felt. And so to the outside world, they really had to put a mask over their true feelings and pretend that they were okay, or perhaps pretend that they were only angry at the perpetrator and didn't have those mixed feelings that we talked about. And then just normalize their feelings and allow them to express their feelings. Check in every time you see the child. Their feelings could absolutely change from time to time that you see them. And make sure not to put your own feelings out there. So typically as the advocate, our feelings are much more clear-cut. We don't like people that hurt kids. But obviously for children and families in this situation, they have a whole host of feelings that is aside from anger. So when a non-offending caregiver learns that their child has been sexually abused, they're really faced with conflicting images of themselves, conflicting images of their child, and of the offender also. They're also in crisis, but often their need for support is overlooked. So let's talk about Chris's parents for a little. So take a moment now and think about how supporting the non-offending caregiver might ultimately benefit the child. So again, this isn't typically the person that we start with. We typically, work with the child first, and then the caregiver is sort of on the outside. But really, when we're talking about kids, I've heard people say if caregivers are okay, then kids are okay. And especially when we're talking about Chris being 5 years old, and really any child, but especially a young child, they're really looking to their caregiver to get an idea for how they should feel about this, how they should deal with this. They're really looking for that person to be sort of their mirror almost. So some ideas about that question, some things that come to mind for myself are that the non-offending caregiver, so mom or dad or others, could benefit from education around just child sexual abuse. So if they understand the dynamics and they understand their child better, then they're better able to parent and respond to the child's needs. I think they can also benefit from processing their own feelings with a counselor or advocate. Again, if they can sort of work on their own stuff, and obviously we would assume or expect that Chris's mom, with this being her father, would have some feelings to work on. And so if she's able to have an outlet for the expression of those feelings with a counselor or advocate, she really maybe would be better than able to parent Chris. It also is helpful, I think, for non-offending caregivers to have some education about trauma responses. So we've talked about Chris maybe having difficulty concentrating in school, or maybe he's really wiggly at home. And so if we can teach mom and dad in this situation, or maybe even others in Chris's family, that these are perhaps responses to Chris's trauma, maybe he's thinking about, what grandpa did to him, then they can really respond to it in a different way instead of just punishing his behavior or not understanding the connection between the behavior and the trauma. So the takeaway message here is really that supporting the non-offending caregiver ultimately benefits the child. Because loss is primary in work with survivors of incest, their response may mimic grief responses, so they may flow in and out at any given time and rarely remain static or the same as their initial response. Let's talk a little bit more about how to address their specific needs. So the way that we address the needs of the non-offending caregiver might actually look very similar to that of the victim. So some things I've already highlighted for the child were validating and normalizing their feelings, just so people don't feel like they're crazy. They know that they're having very normal responses to this abnormal event that's happened in their life. Allowing for expression of these feelings. The caveat here is that all of these things should have an added focus on how the caregiver can take care of themselves while also supporting their child. So it's really important that you remain focused on the child, as their client and their needs, and that working with this caregiver is really beneficial to working with the child. So in Chris's case, if we had the capacity at our agency, we might be able to link his mother or maybe his mom and his dad, or would be really awesome if we could get his sister involved as well, maybe with another counselor at the agency so that they could really have someone to work on their own stuff that's going to come up now that Chris has disclosed sexual abuse by his grandfather. As the child's advocate, you might also need to gently help his mother or father understand how their response is affecting the child. So let's say if Chris's mom continues to talk to the grandfather, we really want to speak with her, maybe again in a gentle way, about what message does this send to Chris, and how can we help her to understand what message that sends to him. So we've really made our way through the bulk of this presentation now, and we've circled back around to the idea of resilience. And we want to leave you with today the idea that children are very naturally resilient, and given the support and encouragement that they need, can thrive and grow following a traumatic event, much like the flower that you see in this image. Now on to the 7 characteristics of resilience. Going to just read a brief description of each of these so that we all have a good understanding of what they mean, although some of them are pretty straightforward. Competence, so the feeling of knowing that you are able to handle something. Confidence, a belief in your abilities. Connection, close ties with family and community. Character, these are the morals and values, the empathy that you might have for others. Contribution, the feeling that everyone has a purpose, the world is better because you are in it. Coping, how we deal with everyday stress, how we deal with challenging life events. And control, having the say over the outcome of a decision. So when I thought about Chris's story, several of the characteristics that stood out to me, and we'll highlight a few of them and go in a little bit more in depth. I was immediately drawn to confidence. When I think about 5-year-olds, they are some of the most confident people I know. If we think about 5-year-olds, they are typically exuding self-esteem. They're the greatest at everything. They draw the greatest pictures. They're the best singers, and that's all so awesome. I wish we could stay that way forever. And so what I thought about also was Chris's love of soccer. And so he might really be able to shine on the soccer field, whatever that means for him, and feel like he's an awesome soccer player. And we can really draw on this confidence that he has innately as a young child. Connection. I thought about this one also. We talked about Chris's family, and I guess for this example, we're not sure if they're able to be supportive or not able to be supportive, but this could also extend out to his community that Allie talked about. And so that could be his friends, the parents of his friends. It could be his teacher. We talked about him having a close relationship with his teacher. So if she was able to understand kind of the trauma that he's been through and understand that his behaviors are perhaps a result of that, she might be someone who can really support him in this situation. And coping, that one also stood out to me for Chris. Let's say that ideally we were able to get Chris's mother and father involved in some counseling at our agency. And then they're able to model that appropriate coping for Chris. So he sees when these things happen that, cause lots of difficulty for people, that it's okay to reach out for help. It's okay to say, I can't do this all on my own and that I need some help with this. And that's a really positive model for him to see. So you as an advocate can play a role in supporting a child's resilience. As we discussed in the previous slide, the sense of connection is pivotal in supporting this resilience. You can promote this sense of connection by linking the child and the non-offending caregiver or the siblings, the other family members, with survivors of sexual abuse in their families. This peer support I've seen can really provide lots of normalization and validation, can just make them feel again like they're not alone, like other families are dealing with this. You can also look for other natural connections in their life. This could be other organizations they're involved with, maybe soccer, maybe a faith or spiritual community, school community, other places that are already natural and already built in, and sort of just tapping into those even further. You can also do this by literally being that connection yourself. So remember way back to one of the first slides that a close relationship with a trusted adult can greatly benefit a child. So simple adaptations that you can make can ultimately reinforce those strengths and build resilience. So maybe the language that you use, deliberately select words that capitalize on their inner resilience, like instead of saying, I'm so sorry this happened to you, oh, you poor baby, this is so terrible, think about flipping that and making it a more positive response, like, you're so brave, I'm so glad you told me, you can survive this, you're a strong kiddo, whatever it might be for you. So as we conclude this presentation, I want to leave you with this quote. Young people who have someone they know is concerned about their well-being, provides them with guidance, structure, and information, and spends frequent time with them do better than those who do not have such relationships. Your role as an advocate is a vital one. You have the opportunity to be the person in a child's life that sees their strengths and supports their inner resilience.
All right, so that concludes our presentation. Thank you, Allie, and thank you, Lexi, for being wonderful speakers. For the next minute or so, we're going to show some slides with resources on them. Please feel free to pause the recording as needed to take down that information. And the final slide will be our contact information. So if you need any assistance at all or would like to contact our speakers with questions, please contact us at that information on the final slide. Thank you very much for joining us today in this recorded webinar, Growing Resiliency, Meeting the Needs of Children Surviving Incest.